Shalom, everybody, and Chag Shavuot Sameach. This is actually a new experience for me. I normally do these things at 3 in the morning, but I'm sure this will work out fine. And I want to dedicate this to our friend, mine and Sheila's friend, Arella, and our cousin Kim, and their friends and families. All of them are in Tel Aviv. So I was sorting through some papers in the attic the other day, and I found my 5th grade report card. And this got me thinking, if a person takes upon himself the profound task, or the chutzpahdik task, of telling you who invented modern literature, now, this is a weighty thing. If a person does that, you have a right to know something about that person. In this case, you have a right to know something about me. And so with that in mind, I'm going to read you part of my 5th grade report card. This is all under needs to improve. There are 4 items here: penmanship, use of time to good advantage, punctuality in completing assignments, attention and response to directions. And to tip the scales a little bit the other way, the teacher, Mr. Kleinman was my 5th grade teacher. In his comments, he wrote this: Robert has a sense of humor. Now, this teacher, Mr. Kleinman, had great insight, because these things are still true today. Okay, I want to tell you a little story. When I was growing up in Hartford, my parents had a bookcase in the living room, and I never saw them take a book out of it. So I knew the position of every book. And let me show you one of them. I think if you put your screen in speaker mode there, you'll be able to see this. You can see that, the Caine Mutiny. This is actually a first edition of the Caine Mutiny. It was published in 1951. And I can tell you that this was on the far left of the top shelf. Now, this is not an amazing thing that I'm able to remember this, because, like I said, it was always there. And it was a kind of comfort to me as a kid that I could depend on these books to be in their appointed places, which of course meant that I could depend on the fact that once my parents put something in the bookcase, they'd never take it out again. All right, well, here's another set of books. This is an old encyclopedia set. It's dated 1924. Let's see this. This is called the American Educator Encyclopedia. And I'm thinking it must have been my mother's when she was in high school. Maybe it was her siblings. In any case, 1924, that means you can't find Israel in here, at least not in its capacity as a modern country. For that matter, if you look up Poland, which I did, it says that Poland is a territory in Central Europe that used to be a country. You can get an interesting perspective on things by flipping through an old encyclopedia like this. And by the way, this encyclopedia set was on the 2nd shelf. Now, maybe you're wondering, what does this all have to do with the girl rabbi of the Golden West? And the answer is that the key to the girl rabbi's invention of modern literature is in that bookcase. But before we get to that, we have to lay some groundwork. So first I want to start with a short discussion about a particular aspect of the Talmud. This is an aspect of the Talmud that will help us greatly in our journey toward understanding the girl rabbi. And after this Talmud discussion, we'll talk about modern literature, since that's the thing that evidently the girl rabbi invented. And finally, we'll get to the girl rabbi herself. Who was she? Well, we'll talk about her. We'll try to determine whether she indeed invented modern literature. Did she or didn't she? Ultimately, you'll have to decide for yourself. All right, so we begin with the Talmud. The particular aspect of the Talmud I want to talk about is the way the Talmud disrupts logic. And to show you what I mean, let's look at a passage from a part of the Talmud. This is a tractate. It's the tractate called Brachot. Let me share the screen. Okay. So you see the passage here on your screen. And the first paragraph that you see here is from the Mishnah, which is the earlier part of the Talmud. And the next two paragraphs are from the Gemara, which is later commentary on the Mishnah. Now, in this case, you can see that the commentary is by two rabbis, Rav Ami and Rav Elazar. They each have a short paragraph. You see them there. Each first of the two paragraphs begins, Rav Ami said. Second one begins, Rav Elazar said. And in each case, they're presumably providing commentary on this passage of Mishnah. So let me start by reading the Mishnah. On Saturday night, we recite Havdalah right after the fourth blessing of the Amidah, which ends with the words, gracious giver of understanding. What is the reason for this? The sages say, because Havdalah marks the onset of the mundane work week. They therefore placed it in the first weekday blessing. So this is a statement about where in the Saturday evening service you start reciting Havdalah. And I put that word understanding in boldface, and I'll get to that. Okay, now we have our first commentary on this by Rav Ami, and I'll read what he said. So Rav Ami said, understanding must be a great thing because the blessing that asks God for understanding was placed at the beginning of the weekday Amidah. Not only that, understanding is also great because it appears in the Bible between two names of God. A God of understanding is the Lord. That last quote by Rav Ami, that's from Shmuel Aleph, the first book of Samuel. And that's how these commentators prove things. They find a quote in the Tanakh and the Hebrew Bible to back up what they're saying. Now, notice that even though you'd think this is commentary on when we begin to recite Havdalah, that's actually not what Rav Ami is talking about. He's talking about the term understanding. Why is he doing this? Well, what has apparently motivated Rav Ami's statement is the presence of the word understanding in the Mishnah, and that's why I put it in boldface. Okay, now let's look at the second commentary. This is by Rav Elazar. Rav Elazar said, the sanctuary must be a great thing because it appears in the Bible between two names of God. The dwelling place that you have made, God, the sanctuary, Lord, that your hands have established. And that quote, passage in quotes, that's from Shirat Hayam, the Song of the Sea in Exodus. Now notice that Rav Elazar, just like Rav Ami, is also not talking about the Mishnah. He's also not talking about Rav Ami's thoughts about the word understanding. Instead, he's pointing out that the sanctuary appears in the Bible between two names of God. It's got nothing to do with Havdalah. It's got nothing to do with understanding. So what prompts him to make this statement? Well, it's evidently the word between in Rav Ami's commentary, where I put that in boldface as well. So you can see that both of these two commentaries, Rav Ami's commentary and Rav Elazar's commentary, each focuses on a word that is not especially significant in the passage where it first appears. All right? The word understanding is not the key word in the Mishnah, and the word between is not the most significant word in Rav Ami's commentary. Now, you could say something like, hey, hold on a minute, it's all significant. We're talking about halakha here, Jewish law. So the word insignificant is not appropriate here. And I'd agree with that, but what I'm talking about here is style, not deep content. This stylistic thing we're talking about, that is the particular aspect of Talmud that we're interested in for our girl rabbi purposes here. Okay, so to summarize this, each rabbi is reminded of something else by a boldface word that I put in boldface. He then proceeds to change the subject, keying off that word, thus disrupting the logical flow of this text. And certainly the logical flow has been disrupted. Otherwise, how do you get from Havdalah to the sanctuary in 30 seconds? Now, maybe we can say that the style of these passages simply amounts to this text being a transcription of a short conversation by two rabbis talking about the Mishnah. And they're simply talking the way people talk, where, one person changes the subject by keying off a word of interest in something that the other person said. Well, when you put it like that, it sounds like we're not talking about anything especially substantial here. Sounds like we're talking about something pretty mundane. It's just the way people talk. But let's look through a different window. People say a different lens, but I don't like that expression. So we look through a different window into this aspect of human communication. And this might give us an indication that there actually might be something pretty substantial going on here, just at the level of style alone. So in order to look through this different window, I'm going to talk about computer programming a little bit. I can't help myself, I'm sorry, but this will be pretty short, so bear with me. All right, one thing computer programmers have tried to do over the many years, is write a software program that can in some way track or understand a human conversation. And they've had a lot of success with this. But there's one aspect of this task, of this artificial intelligence task, that's what it is, one aspect that programmers just haven't been able to figure out. And it goes like this. Suppose a conversation has a change of subject somewhere in the middle of it, kind of like this Talmud example we were just looking at. So that means there's an earlier part of the conversation where the people are talking about one thing, and then there's a later part of the conversation where people are talking about something else. The thing that's hard for programmers to figure out is this. How do you write a software program in such a way as to make the computer know which parts of the earlier conversation are still relevant in the later part of the conversation, and which parts of the earlier conversation are no longer relevant? So what this AI dilemma tells us, at least for our purposes here, having to do with the girl rabbi and modern literature and so forth. What this dilemma tells us is that even a simple change of subject, like the ones we saw, has got a certain depth under the surface. Now, it isn't just AI, but philosophy as well, where this seemingly mundane business of changing the subject comes into play. So this is a big deal, for instance, for Emmanuel Levinas, who was a mid-20th century French Talmudist and philosopher. One of his issues is that the presence of logical reasoning in our lives puts us in a state of mind where it's easy for us to relegate too much authority to so-called experts. Now, why are we susceptible to sometimes unnecessarily deferring to experts? Unnecessarily deferring to experts, that's key. Well, maybe it's because in its rightful place, logical reasoning does have well-deserved power. All the inventions that populate our lives, from medicine to airplanes to computers, all the science and math and engineering we rely on, it wouldn't be possible without logical reasoning. So according to Levinas, what this means is that we're easily taken in by anyone who purports to have logic-based expertise. We're blinded by the logic. And another reason we find ourselves getting blinded is for the odd reason that there is a world of facts, too many facts out there. Too many facts for these experts to choose from when they're looking for facts to use as their initial assumptions, the foundation stones of whatever reasoning it is they're trying to build up. There are just too many facts in the world. And experts have preconceived attitudes just like everyone else. And these preconceived attitudes lead them to choose certain facts rather than others as their starting points, which is to say that in a way, people are entitled to their own facts. Now, I want to be very careful what I'm saying here, to not sound like I'm anti-reason in any way. I mean, Dr. Fauci is great. I would follow him to the ends of the earth. Don't get me wrong. But what about the brilliant, highly educated political scientists and former professors, Robert McNamara and McGeorge Bundy? I wouldn't follow them to the ends of the earth. Their expertise was a major contributor to the loss in the Vietnam War of 58,000 American lives and 2 million Vietnamese lives. Now, for sure, McNamara and Bundy weren't the only contributors to this. But you know what? This is small comfort to the families of 2,058,000 people. So according to Levinas, it is a positive value to be wary of logical reasoning, even to disrupt it when necessary. Now, Levinas celebrates the Talmud for its ability to loosen a person's subjection to reason, to disrupt reason, if you like. And one way the Talmud does that is to keep you off balance with the kinds of subject changes we were just looking at in our Talmud passage. Now, I already pointed out that a person could say that the Talmud is, oh, it's just a transcription of rabbis in conversation. Oh, no, when people converse, they sometimes change the subject, make such a big deal out of it. They change the subject the way we saw in our Talmud example. It's very mundane. Mundane. Well, regardless of the mundane source of this particular power of the Talmud, the power is nonetheless there. So Levinas recommends that in order to loosen the inordinate hold of logic in our lives, we spend a little time each day learning Talmud. And how could you go wrong with that? Okay, well, we've covered the particular aspect of Talmud I wanted to talk about. So let's keep that on a back burner. And now let's get to the second part of our session. We're going to talk about modern literature. Now, one of the hallmarks of early modern literature at the time of its birth in the early 20th century is stream of consciousness writing. And that is the particular aspect of modern literature that we'll be interested in here. So let's look at some examples. We're going to first look at a very simple example to kind of get our feet wet and get our bearings with this. And then we'll look at a couple of other examples, a little more complicated, but more interesting. So here are our examples. Again, you should see three paragraphs, different three paragraphs. So in the first paragraph, that's our first example. And that's from Virginia Woolf's novel, Jacob's Room. Now we have a scene here in which a woman named Betty has been darning. She puts away her darning needles safely in a drawer. She gets up. She takes a walk out on the moor behind her house. This is in rural England, so there are moors and heaths and things like that behind people's houses. Anyway, this moor winds through an old Roman burial ground. We have the lines that you see in this first example. I'll read them. The moor accepted everything. The Roman skeletons are in safekeeping. Betty's darning needles are safe too. Now, even though this is third-person narration, we can tell we're eavesdropping on Betty's thoughts. Now, how can we tell? Well, through the association with the word safe between the dead Romans and the darning needles. They're both safe. And safe is the word that connects them. But here's the thing, because this association is non-logical, that is, there's no logical connection between buried soldiers and darning needles. Because the connection's non-logical, we can tell we're listening in on someone's random thoughts. Now, notice that the mechanics of this association are very much like what we saw in the Talmud passage. One thought keys off a word in another thought, and that word kind of joins the two seemingly unrelated thoughts together. So this sort of association is not only characteristic of a change of topic on a conversation, well, that's what we saw in the Talmud example, but it's also characteristic of a change of topic in a single person's casual thought processes, which is what we see here. Now, you may know that the term usually used for this is associative thinking. And in written form, this kind of writing is a form, a pretty simple form of what's called stream of consciousness writing. Okay, now let's look at the second example. Now, this is also by Virginia Woolf. It's from her novel, Mrs. Dalloway. And what we have here is a snippet of passing thoughts by a woman named Clarissa Dalloway. She's the heroine of the story. There, Big Ben boomed, first a warning, musical, then the hour irrevocable. Heaven only knows why one loves it so. The veriest frumps can't be dealt with, she felt positive, by acts of parliament. For that very reason, they love life. On this excerpt, the sound of Big Ben signals a joy that even an act of parliament can't suppress. We're talking about Big Ben, and all of a sudden we have an act of parliament. Now, this is a more complicated example than the first, because first of all, if we look at the association between Big Ben and acts of parliament, what words play the role here that the word safe played in Jacob's Room? What words connect Big Ben and acts of parliament? Well, those connecting words are actually unstated, and that's one of the complications here. The words are Palace of Westminster, of all things. Now, why? The point is that the actual Palace of Westminster happens to be home to both Big Ben and the Houses of Parliament. And Woolf's English readers would know that. Well, there's also a second association in this passage as well. Clarissa uses the word love to refer to her love of the sound of Big Ben, and also to the various frumps, wherever they are, who love life, just average people, like average women or something, I don't know. So this is a more complicated example in that there are two associations in this one short passage, and one of those associations has an implicit connector, Palace of Westminster. All right, so finally, let's get to the third example. And this is by James Joyce, and it's from his novel Ulysses. Now, Ulysses is filled with this stream of consciousness stuff. You want to read a little stream of consciousness, read that book. It's a wonderful book. Maybe most of you have read it. If not, you owe it to yourself at some point. Check it out. Anyway, what we have in this example are the thoughts of a man named Leopold Bloom. And he has stopped in a church to hear the organ and choir music. And here are his thoughts. Some of that old sacred music is splendid. Mozart's 12th Mass, the Gloria in that. Those old popes were keen on music, on art, and statues and pictures of all kinds, healthy too, chanting, regular hours, then brew liqueurs, Benedictine. So here, just like in that Mrs. Dalloway example we just looked at, there are two non-logical associations. In the first one, you have the word music, which connects the music he's listening to with the old popes, as he calls them, being keen on music. In the second association, you have the word popes itself that connects the popes listening to music to the popes brewing Benedictine liqueur. Now there's an extra little twist in here. The popes didn't do that. The popes didn't brew Benedictine liqueur. But I think if indeed it's popes we're talking about, and not just clericals in general, I don't know what Leopold Bloom meant here. But I think that Joyce throws in this little misunderstanding or bit of wonderment or whatever it is on the part of Leopold Bloom to remind us, the readers, that Mr. Bloom is actually Jewish. So he wouldn't necessarily be up on this kind of thing, the business with the popes. The only thing he's doing in this church is listening to the music. Okay. Well, finally, we get to the girl rabbi of the Golden West. Not so fast. No. First, I need to go back to my parents' bookcase. You remember the bookcase. And I said it would figure into our discussion in an important way. All right. One of the books I showed you back at the beginning was the first volume of an encyclopedia. It was this book here. Well, there was also another set of books that I thought was an encyclopedia when I was a kid. They are green books that look like encyclopedia volumes, but they're not. I would occasionally flip through one of these heavy green books. I actually have one of them right here. And I was confused by the odd passages I found there. I wrote this set of books off as some strange Jewish encyclopedia that I figured I would understand when I was older. Well, I'm older. I've long since inherited all these books from my parents, and I still don't understand these green ones, at least not in the way I once imagined I might. These volumes, it turns out, are an English edition of the Talmud, but not just any edition. They are the Isaac Mayer Wise translation and formulation, as he called it, of the Talmud. Now, let me hold this up. So if you're in speaker view, you may be able to make out this back here, the Babylonian Talmud. I can hardly read it myself. I hold up the front. You can see that the Magen David, Star of David, shows pretty well. And the reason that shows so well and the spine doesn't is because when this book was in the bookcase, this was protected by the books next to it. This was exposed to the air for God knows how many years. And this is the result. I think Monk would have figured something out like that, if you know what I'm talking about. So I have to say, I have no idea why my parents had this. I cannot imagine either of them ever reading anything like this. I don't know. Maybe they got it as a wedding present. So, what about Isaac Mayer Wise? Well, you may know that Rabbi Wise was the founder of Hebrew Union College. First in Cincinnati, that was its first campus. And he founded it in 1875. Now, this Reformed seminary, it's very interesting. It accepted women as students right from the beginning. It didn't ordain them, but they allowed women to fully participate in the academic program. And one of Wise's seminary students was a woman named Rachel Frank. She called herself Ray Frank. And here she is. I think I need to lower this a little. You see her there. So you can see that she was young here. She was born around 1860 in San Francisco, and she actually lived till almost 1950 when she was about 90. She lived a good long life, and she was a woman who, even though she did not have rabbinic ordination, she was essentially accepted as a rabbi when she went back to California after spending time with Rabbi Wise in Cincinnati. Not having ordination did not stop her from, what we should call it. Maybe she would have called it spreading the word. I don't know. But in any case, she would travel around California giving lectures and sermons and divrei Torah to different communities. And they advertised these speaking engagements with posters where she was labeled the girl rabbi of the Golden West. So, see, I didn't make that up. It would have been kind of politically incorrect if I did, but that's what they called her. Now, when she was in Oakland, California, she spent some time there. She stayed there long enough to teach religious school at Oakland's Reformed Temple Sinai, which is I guess it's a famous temple because maybe it's the oldest or one of the oldest Reformed temples in the country, one of the oldest, and it's still there. Now, one of her students at Temple Sinai was a girl who would grow up to be the avant-garde literary personality Gertrude Stein. That's right, Gertrude Stein went to Hebrew school. And I'm going to guess here that Ray Frank didn't just teach Gertrude Stein the traditional religious school subjects. I will bet that the young Ms. Stein learned Talmud with Ray Frank. No, maybe along the lines of the Talmud passage we just looked at earlier. Even if Ray Frank didn't have the whole class learning Talmud, she might have worked separately with Gertrude Stein, who apparently was a very smart kid. Now, years later, long after her student days with Rabbi Frank, Gertrude Stein lived in Paris. You may know things about her, and you may know that. And you may probably know she became known, among other things, as a mentor to young writers. And the writers were attracted to her because they wanted to learn the experimental writing techniques that she developed. These literary apprentices included Ernest Hemingway, James Joyce, and indirectly William Faulkner, Virginia Woolf. Virginia Woolf actually learned Gertrude Stein's techniques, not from Gertrude Stein, but from James Joyce. I think Scott Fitzgerald might have been in on that. In any case, you can see Gertrude Stein's influence in a lot of the work of these writers. We just did, right? Stream of consciousness techniques, like making the non-logical associations of the word safe in Jacob's room. Those are the main stylistic tools that Ms. Stein taught to these writers. And admittedly, these elements of style could get much more complicated than the examples we saw. But as we noticed, associations like this are like the non-logical associations of the words understanding and between that we saw back in our passage from the Talmud. Okay, so let's stop and take stock here and put together the pieces that we have kind of lying on the table in front of us. If we put these pieces in the right order, what we get is a complete chain of evidence. Virginia Woolf learned the associative technique from James Joyce, who learned it from Gertrude Stein, who learned it from the girl rabbi of the Golden West, who learned it from the Talmud. That is, what I'm saying is that a good deal of the imaginative literature of the early 20th century may simply amount to imitation of this right here. My parents' edition of the Babylonian Talmud, which, by the way, was on the second shelf of the bookcase next to the encyclopedia. But who's to say for sure? You decide. All right. I think I've stretched this speculation about as far as I can. So again, Chag Shavuot Sameach, and thank you for listening.